Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing about the government policies to redistribute income and wealth and create more equal distribution of income, close the disparities between the rich and the poor, and reduce relative poverty. So that's all clubbed into one thing as redistribution of income and wealth in society. Now, the policies that are aimed to redistribute income and wealth in society, because that is one of the macroeconomic objectives, not a very core macroeconomic objective, but yes, it is one of the macroeconomic objectives to create equal and equitable distribution of income in society. Now, how does the government do that? The simple step is that the government directly intervenes in the labor markets, basically. And all these policies are designed keeping in view of the fact that at times what happens is that if the labor markets are left completely free, to operate without any sort of government intervention, then the possibility is, or one of the negative outcomes of that is that it can create unequal distribution of income and wealth, and then create poverty and relative poverty, right? So what the government does is that the government sort of intervenes in the labor market, and it comes up with certain policies that are aimed at reducing those disparities of income. One of the ways in which the government could do is that it could basically give transfer payments. That is the first thing that you need to mention. Now guys, as far as transfer payments are concerned, we know that transfer payments could be used to redistribute incomes and provide different sorts of assistance to different groups in the economy, and the objective is to improve their living standards. That is the objective that you need to write in your analysis. And the examples of transfer payments you need to write in the exam is that they could include, let's say, child support assistance, unemployment benefits like job seekers allowances, and let's say payments to the disabled, medical allowances, etc. So basically, how transfer payments work is that transfer payments basically prevent those people who are unfortunate enough, who don't have enough money to get those skills that are needed to find work, and ultimately they will end up living in extreme poverty. So transfer payments prevent that from happening. It prevents all those who are unfortunate enough and don't have the skills that are required to find work and get a job and make a living. So it prevents those people to actually be living in extreme or absolute poverty lives, right? And it also allows all those who have children, to maintain a decent standard of living, or people who are disabled to maintain a decent standard of living. And ultimately what it does is that it increases the incomes for the poor. That's the whole objective, right? And as a result, it helps, or it is a way to sort of close the large income disparities that are occurring in society, right? But when you're evaluating these policies, so against evaluation for transfer payments, you could write that one of the negative things is that it creates dependency, on these benefits, and ultimately some people would then never want to find work because they're happy living on unemployment benefits because the government is supporting them, and this may create an unintended consequence, sort of creating voluntary levels of unemployment, and this is not good for the future growth of the economy, right? Also, you could say that these transfer payments put a huge strain on government finances, and maybe the government might not be able to afford it, or maybe the government might not be able to sustain huge levels of government, finance, transfer size of the transfer payments in the long run. The second point that you could mention about how could government reduce income disparities, reduce the relative poverty, reduce the unequal distribution of income in society is that the government could spend on essential goods and services. Now, a lot of people basically say this point as writing that the government could increase its government spending. Now, you need to be very specific that what sort of government spending is increasing. So what I'm going to be saying is that you write that government spending on essential goods and services will actually increase. When you say that goods that are essential goods and services, what we are saying is that those goods that are socially desirable and that generate positive externalities of consumption, such as healthcare, education, sanitation, water supplies, because they can ensure that the poor members of the economy have access to essential goods and services, which will increase their living standards, which is the entire objective. And this policy would ultimately reduce income inequality in society by allowing the poor people to have a means to increase their productivity levels, increase their skills, and ultimately increase their incomes as well. So yes, spending on essential goods and services is very important, but when you're evaluating such spending, you could say that as far as evaluation is concerned, you could write that these policies would obviously cost the government large sums of money, and where funding these policies would carry a severe opportunity cost because the government needs to fund these policies, and then funding these policies could come up. Financing or funding these policies would mean that either the money has to be borrowed which will increase national debt of the economy and the debt to GDP ratio, or it could mean that taxes in the future would rise, right? Which obviously has an opportunity cost, because let's say if these taxes are regressive in nature, then which are rising in the future to, finance the funding which is done on these policies of spending on essential goods and services. So maybe if the taxes that are increased are regressive in nature, such as indirect taxes, such as VAT, or let's say fuel duties, if they go up, if they increase to partly fund this spending, then ultimately the poor will suffer, which will actually worsen the income inequality. And ultimately, this is contradicting the intentions of these policies, because these policies were intended to reduce income inequality. Ultimately, maybe in the short term they did, but it reverted back to, increasing the income inequality, and whatever good work that these policies did is now offset by again reversing back to the original situation because of indirect taxes, since the poor are suffering now. So temporarily you made the poor happy by spending on essential goods and services, but then you make them sad because you sort of ended up with regressive taxes to fund these policies, right? And contradicting the intentions of these policies. So if you write like this, it's a good thing. Also, you could say that if the government funds these policies through cutting spending, let's say, on other areas of the economy, such as if the government is cutting spending from public transport. Again, public transport is so important, so essential for the poor. A lot of poor people rely on public transport for daily commute. So once again, it would have negative impacts, and could again well be suffer. Those negative impacts would be well suffered by the poor people who are relying on such services. You could talk about that in evaluation, right? So the third thing that we could talk about is that the government could come up with taxation policies. Now, as far as taxation policies are concerned, what we could write is that the government could implement, or let's say adjust, progressive income taxation in the economy. How? By, let's say, increasing taxes on workers with salaries who are in the highest income tax bands. So people whose salaries are in the highest income tax bands, the government could increase taxes on those workers, that is taxing more, increasing the marginal rate of income tax on the rich. Or the government could reduce in sorry the or the government could increase income tax allowances on people with lower income tax bands, so giving them more income tax allowances or on those people who are on lower income tax bands, which will free up their tax burden basically. And the government will then use the extra revenue that is collected by taxing the rich more through progressive tax system, by increasing the marginal rate of progressive taxes and income taxes on people with the upper income tax bands. And the extra revenue that is collected would be used to finance transfer payments, and that spending could be that money could be spent back on welfare payments, or let's say on extra government spending on education and healthcare, which has positive externalities associated to it, and they especially benefit the poor, right? And what is going to happen is that this will basically reduce disposable incomes for the rich. Okay, fine, this will reduce disposable incomes for the rich, but that is not a problem, because at the same time the disposable incomes of the rich will go down, but simultaneously it will increase the disposable incomes at the lower end for the poor because of more income tax allowances given to them, right? Increasing disposable incomes at the lower end for the poor, which will ultimately reduce the income inequality, closing the gap between the rich and the poor, since disposable income for the rich goes down and the disposable incomes for the poor goes up. So it closes that income disparity, or the gap between the rich and the poor, right? So another thing that you could mention in the taxation policies is that the government could simultaneously reduce regressive taxes, because regressive taxes, we know, they take a higher proportion of income from the poor, as compared to the rich. So there's less tax burden on the rich as compared to the poor, because they end up paying a higher proportion or percentage of income in taxes. That is the poor, right? So for example, VAT and fuel duties, and by reducing these taxes, we are increasing the disposable incomes for the poor. Since you're reducing these taxes, so the incomes the poor can keep with themselves, that is disposable incomes, they can keep with themselves. They could actually now spend that income back on, back on consuming consumer goods, which will increase their welfare and living standards, and again reduce income inequality in society. But there are certain problems associated with these taxation policy. First of all, when you're saying that you are increasing the marginal rate of income taxes for the rich with people on the highest income tax bands, so you are disincentivizing a lot of people for hard work, because a lot of people who have the incentive to sort of increase their incomes and work harder to increase their incomes, you are creating a disincentive for those people who will now feel that if they increase their incomes, they will be heavily taxed now, right? And workers might feel dissatisfied, right? And probably they might not want to work hard to increase their to increase their incomes, and that is not a good thing for the economic growth in society, right? You would also argue that it would such policies could such policies, especially reducing regressive taxes, on one hand they do boost disposable incomes for the poor because it reduces the tax burden on them. But at the same time, regressive taxes are also a significant portion of the government's revenue. So it is going to reduce government finances, substantially reduce government finances, and the government might end up in a budget deficit, and then it has to borrow, increasing debt. Now, public debt would go up, and government also uses tax money to finance government spending on essential public services. So that element or that area could suffer as well. You could mention that as an evaluation. The fourth point, again an important one, is the probably the introduction of minimum wages. Now we know that minimum wages could directly boost the incomes of the poorest in society, right? And a minimum wage, the government could set a minimum wage which is above the equilibrium wage rate in the labor market, which sort of acts as a wage floor, protecting the workers who don't have such skills. It protects those workers basically who don't have those skills, that they could use those skills to get higher wages so that they could have a decent living standards. But it protects those workers, in a lot of to have a decent living standards. Let's say in sectors such as retail, supermarket, all other sectors, these minimum wages could be implemented nationwide, such as leisure, recreation, manufacturing, factory workers. So with higher wages, those who are at the lower end of the income spectrum, they will be able to move out of relative poverty by improving their material and the non-material living standards, which will close the income gap in a country. So you could also draw the diagram for minimum wages, where you could say that this is the demand for labor, and this is your supply of labor, and this is your equilibrium wage rate, which is not really enough for a lot of workers, let's say. So the government could come up with minimum wages by implementing W minimum, which is your minimum wage, and that is the minimum wage. This much is the minimum amount of wages that needs to be paid, which will sort of reduce the quantity demanded for workers to QD, increase the quantity supplied for workers at QS, and this is representing unemployment because the demand for workers goes down. It contracts the demand for workers, or it extends the supply of workers. So this is something that you could mention. Although yes, it does, minimum wages does benefit by giving higher wages to the poorest in society, but then it also create inefficient outcomes because minimum wages can distort efficient labor market outcomes, and it causes unemployment. Uh, in fact, if it's causing unemployment, then it's harming those it is supposed to protect, right? Minimum wages was supposed to protect, that was the intention, but now it's harming those who it was supposed to protect. So those people, and then what happens is at times what happens is that those people who have extremely low skills, right, they may find it very difficult to find work at a higher wage rate, because they may find it very difficult to work at the minimum wage, especially those people who have very poor skills, because their productivity would not be enough for firms to justify their employment at the minimum wage. So even at the minimum wage, if their productivity, their skills are so poor, then what happens is that their wage rate, even the minimum wage rate is not justified for those kind of people, especially their productivity level is so low because of low skills, that it is not enough for firms to justify their employment at the minimum wage. So in this sense, it could sort of increase employment, it could increase unemployment in that sense, right? Which could make the gap between the rich and the poor even worse. So this is sort of worsening the income inequality in society rather than reducing it. So it's a good evaluation against minimum wages that you can write. So we can argue that yes, minimum wages do boost incomes of the poorest in society, reducing the income inequality, but we can't ignore the fact that minimum wages can distort efficient labor market outcomes and cause unemployment, harming those people that it is supposed to protect. Now, another thing that you could mention is that apart from just apart from just governments coming up with minimum wages and implementing taxation policies, adjusting taxes and bringing out progressive taxes and reducing regressive taxes, the government could also target the root cause of inequality of incomes and wealth, and that is the root cause is the problems regarding education, healthcare, healthcare, education, training levels. So the government could start spending more on education, training, and healthcare to boost the productivity of the workers, and in this way, it is addressing the very root cause of the poor people who have poor living standards and they are living in relative poverty. Right. So the government could basically increase spending on training, on education, on healthcare, which and ultimately you need to relate it. Don't just say that the government will do this. Say explain, analyze, create the chain of analysis. How will this reduce income inequality? So what you need to write is that the government will increase the spending on training and healthcare, which will manifest itself into higher productivity because of improved training on healthcare and education and training. And higher productivity would mean higher incomes of firms because these workers, when they will be more productive, they would generate more incomes and profits of firms. Hence, this will finally translate into higher wages for the workers. So, if the firm's profits and incomes go up, they would ultimately end up giving more wages to the workers because now it's justified for higher wages. They're justified for higher wages. Also, healthcare improves productivity because it reduces absences from work, right? But the evaluation is that these policies, such as implementing healthcare and spending on healthcare education and training, are number one expenses, puts huge strain on the government finances. Also, a lot of the governments might not be able to afford, especially the governments of the poor countries, because some of these countries are also on very tight and tough, strict budget controls, right? Budgetary controls, you could say that, because maybe they are trying to reduce their public debt. We know that when government spends more, it results into budget deficits. And budget deficits means that the government needs to finance that budget deficit by borrowing, and borrowing results into public debt. So a lot of the governments at times they are coming up with, you could say, and these, by the way, policies to reduce public debt are known as austerity policies. So at times the government is coming up with austerity policies to sort of reduce the public debt. Um, and when that happens, which means that they need to cut down their spending then if they have these austerity policies to reduce public debt, because that's the only way to reduce government spending. They need to cut down their spending. So cutting down that spending, so which means that they are on very strict budgetary controls, and in that sense, you can't really spend on education, healthcare, and training as you want to, as much as you want to, right? So you could mention that. Also, there are time lags involved, which means that it takes time. Explain what time lags mean. And it takes time for training, healthcare, and education, spending on education to actually boost productivity, and then to finally translate into higher incomes. It won't happen in the short run. It will definitely, but it will take. This will happen in the long run. So this might not be a good policy to reduce income inequality in the short run, but yeah, it is a good policy for the long run, right? Also, so do mention the fact that these policies regarding spending on education, healthcare, and training is addressing the root cause of poverty and income inequality. So that's it for this video, guys. I'll see you all around in the next video, which is on general evaluation of the policies to redistribute income. Until then, take care.